All right, folks, good afternoon. My name is Kalevi Ekman. I'm professor of Aalto University, and normally on Mondays this time we are having here my lecture about interdisciplinary product development. But my beloved colleague from the School of Arts, Design and Architecture, Professor Teemu, made me an offer that was not possible to refuse. So that's why we are having something very special today. And Teemu, would you like to introduce our guest speaker?
Thank you. I guess I don't need to introduce for you folks Richard Stallman, as you found your way over here. We are happy to have so many of you in here, and we have plenty of time. Richard will give a talk, and I hope there will be time for questions as well. And
I think so.
We use the thing which you can throw for
What
people.
is it?
It's a microphone.
Oh.
So you can throw it for people, and they
Weird.
get the microphone. But Richard Stallman, please.
I want to start by asking you for a couple of favors. First of all, if you take a photo of me, please do not put it in Facebook or Instagram. That company is a monstrous surveillance engine. It does more surveillance than you realize if you're not an expert. It does surveillance on its useds. I don't call them its users because it's using them. And it does surveillance on everyone else on the net. So if you put the photo of someone in Facebook, you're giving that company one more way to do surveillance on that person. We could dispute whether putting a photo of your friend into Facebook is decent treatment of a friend, but if you're not my friend, that doesn't directly affect me. However, putting a photo of me in those sites does directly hurt me, so please don't. Second, if you make a recording of this talk and you want to distribute copies, please do so only in the formats that are favorable to free software, which means the OGG formats and WebM. Above all, not in Flash, which means don't put it in YouTube, and make sure, and also of course not in QuickTime or Windows Media Player. And make sure that normal use of the site does not involve running any non-free JavaScript code, which means, again, not in YouTube. And please put on the recordings the Creative Commons No Derivatives license, because this is a presentation of a point of view. So, you will see many activities that state that their goal is digital inclusion or closing the digital divide. They take for granted that being part of a digital society is good, which is really dumb. It's foolish, because they're missing a crucial point. Participation in a digital society can be good or bad depending on whether that digital society is free or subjugating. If digital society doesn't respect people's freedom, then the right goal is digital extraction of the victims of that oppression. So what are the threats to our freedom in the digital society, and what can we do about them? First, I want to talk about surveillance, since I already mentioned it. We see now that digital technology is a recipe for totalitarian, oppressive surveillance far beyond what the Soviet Union was able to do. I'm sure Stalin would have loved to surveil everyone as much as we are all being surveilled by digital technology today, but there was no way he could do it with the technology available to him. Now, some surveillance is done directly by governments, and some surveillance is done by companies. But although superficially it's different, the data collected by the companies is available to the governments, so really it all ends up as part of the surveillance that threatens our freedom. But why does it threaten our freedom? Well, there's surveillance beyond of people in general, beyond a certain level, is incompatible with democracy. The state is the most powerful entity that we encounter in our lives. If you imagine the violence that an underground gang might be capable of, well, the state could do 1,000 times more. But we need to have a state. We need a state to do things like provide food to people who need it, and medical care, and education, and fund research, and build roads, and dozens of other things, regulate all the businesses to make sure they're not cheating us, and that the food is what it says it is, and there aren't toxic chemicals in our clothing, and so many things. So we have to have a state. How do we prevent it from hurting us? We need democratic control of the state. But how do we exercise control over what the state does when the state is doing things secretly that we don't know about? We need whistleblowers to tell us what the state is doing. There's an old conundrum. Who will watch the watchman? Now we know the answer. Whistleblowers watch the watchman. People like our hero, Edward Snowden. 3 cheers for Edward Snowden. Hip, hip, hooray. Hip, hip, hooray. Hip, hip, hooray. But typically the state labels whistleblowers as criminals and tries to punish them, whether legally or not. And the problem with surveillance is, once the level of surveillance of everybody in general is high enough that the state can always identify the whistleblower, the state can always persecute the whistleblower, and it will take a real hero like Snowden to dare to try. Well, heroes are scarce. We really want it to be easier and safer to be a whistleblower so that anybody who just has a strong conscience will do it. Which means we've got to make sure the surveillance isn't enough to identify whistleblowers. If the state can always tell who spoke with this journalist, that's too much. It's too much for democracy to continue. Well, when people propose to address the problem of massive surveillance, the first solution they propose is to impose rules on the state's access to the massive databases about everybody. But that doesn't help, because the rules always say that the state can access the databases to find a criminal. So once the state says whoever blew the whistle is a criminal, this justifies accessing what the state needs to access to find the whistleblower. The only dependable solution is to redesign digital systems so that they don't collect a massive dossier about every person. So that even if the state constructs an excuse to try to find a whistleblower, the data just isn't there. We can describe 3 different methods of surveilling people. One is through their own systems, their own digital products, their own computers, for instance. That happens if you're running non-free software that's not under the user's control. It's very likely to be designed to spy on the user and report. Spyware is known in various proprietary programs, including Microsoft Windows, the software of the iThings, Flash Player, Angry Birds, the software of the Amazon Swindle, and nearly all portable phones. So if you use a non-free program, it's very likely to be spying on you. Now, that kind of spying we can block. We just have to reject non-free software, which there are many other reasons to reject anyway. But spying is also done through systems that we work with but don't own. For instance, phone companies and ISPs. We communicate through them, but their computers don't belong to us, and if they're running free software, it's the phone company or the ISP that will have control over it, not us. So when those systems are designed to spy on people, as European Union law requires them to be, there's nothing we can do. Well, we can resist a little bit. I never identify myself to connect to the internet. It's a personal rule. If a network portal would require me to identify myself, for instance, if it's in a hotel and I'd have to put in my room number, nope, I will not connect that way. And you can help other people resist by maintaining wireless networks with no password, which is a very important thing for you to do to resist the all-knowing and all-controlling state. But what we really need to do is organize politically to demand an end to general surveillance of, that is, of people in general. There are also systems that exist purely for surveillance. For instance, in the UK, they've established cameras by the side of the roads to track all car travel. There was an article about this in a newspaper 10 years ago saying that the UK was tracking all car travel, making it a database which they could easily keep as long as they wish so that they could find out where any given car went on a given night 6 years ago, and they can track any car in real time too. Systems like this are a gun pointed straight at democracy. And it's not just theoretically that we know this. They already used that system to arrest suspected would-be protesters so that they couldn't get to the protest. They were held by the thugs until the protest was over and it was too late. I don't believe they were charged with anything. So, you don't have to guess. And of course, nowadays, the latest fashion is accuse dissidents of being terrorists. Anytime a measure is adopted that's labeled as anti-terrorist, I think anti-dissident. And we've seen that particular pattern in many countries, including the United States. Some people had a protest in which they dropped a banner a few months ago, and the banner was painted with some glitter. A little bit of glitter dripped off the banner, so they were accused of carrying out a terrorist hoax. I'm not making this up. It sounds crazy, but it's true. And once again, the only way we can stop that kind of surveillance is by organizing politically. A whistleblower in the US was just sentenced to prison. He was found by looking at the phone call records of everyone in the Associated Press. If they can find who spoke with a journalist, they can always find the whistleblower. For more information about this and about how to redesign digital systems so that they don't accumulate a massive dossier about people in general, see gnu.org/philosophy/surveillance vs democracy.html. Because there are many kinds of systems that have been designed to keep all the data they can, because that's standard engineering practice. Save all the data you can. And it doesn't have to be done that way, but of course governments would like it to be done that way. They'd like to collect more information about everyone. So they don't use the other options that do exist. But we can make them use the other options. We're going to have to require that all the digital systems people use be redesigned so that they collect the minimum possible information about people in general. Now, in some cases, surveillance is necessary. We want the state to find real criminals, which requires investigation. But because we want to keep this in check, we must insist that the state only be able to collect information about the people that have been identified as suspects. What becomes dangerous is when systems collect information about everybody, and it's there to look at for a long time afterwards if the state ever wishes to. And it doesn't matter whether this database is directly in state hands or in the hands of some business, as if it is available to the state to look at when it comes up with an excuse, then it's part of massive, dangerous surveillance. The next threat to our freedom in the digital society comes from censorship. 15 years ago, we thought that the internet would make censorship a thing of the past. Now we know that any state can censor the internet if it's willing to go to some expense and provoke a certain amount of anger from its citizens. So censorship today is not limited to obvious tyrannies such as China and Iran. It's also found in supposedly free countries such as Finland. In 2006, I believe, Finland imposed mandatory filtering on access to websites. Someone decided to investigate what the system was doing by experiment. He got a list of sites to try and checked whether he could access them, and he made a list of the sites that were blocked and posted this on a website in Finland. Guess what? They added his site to the filter list. Access to his site was blocked. The law didn't say that it authorized censorship of sites that report on Finnish censorship, but they did it anyway. He went to court. A few months ago, the Supreme Court of Finland approved censorship of access to his site. The site is still running. You can access it from other countries. You just can't access it from Finland. Now, I can't imagine anything more blatantly unjust in the area of censorship than this. This is censorship of information about state actions that affect people's human rights. If some newspaper has some courage, it might try publishing a similar list and see whether the state dares censor access to the newspaper's site. Similar filters are found in many countries. I believe the UK and France and Spain and Italy and Turkey, about 4 or 5 years ago, announced that all internet users would have to choose between censorship and more censorship, and even more censorship, and yet more censorship. There were protests in the street, but the government went ahead with censorship anyway. And just recently, it announced a plan for more sophisticated censorship, and there were again protests in the street which were suppressed with water cannon. a few days ago. Well, bravo for the Turks who protested. I'd like to see people in other countries protest as strongly. The UK did something similar recently. They announced that in addition to certain censorship which was going to be imposed on everyone, by default there would be even more censorship. And if you can afford your own net connection, you can turn off the additional censorship and go back to censorship level 1. But if you can't afford your own net connection, if you have to use public access portals or a library, then you're going to be stuck with censorship level 2. Australia doesn't have mandatory filtering. Instead, it has censorship of links. There are sites it's illegal to link to. Electronic Frontier Australia was ordered to remove a link to a foreign political website on pain of being fined $11,000 a day. And what was this site? No, it was not a terrorist site. It was something almost as disgusting. It was an anti-abortion website. But they have the right to present their views. We have to defend their right to present their views, whatever we think about those views, even in Australia. In India, websites can be taken down by administrative decree if they are found to insult anybody's religion, which means there are a lot of issues that can't be discussed, a lot of works of fiction that can't be published, and so on. Censorship is taking over the net. Of course, we can find underground ways to resist censorship, but really we have to organize in opposition, firm opposition to censorship. I've seen works that I considered disgusting. Censorship is more disgusting. No matter what it is we dislike, we must recognize that we shouldn't try to stop people from saying it. Now, the things that many people find disgusting are very useful as excuses for setting up censorship. Show people something that they are likely to look at and say, oh, this is disgusting, and maybe you can get away with establishing the system of censorship, which of course then gets extended to censor other things as well, anything that somebody wants blocked. A representative of the IFPI, which is the International Organization of Record Companies, said at an international event that he found child pornography a great excuse for getting filters imposed, and once the filters are used for that, they can be used to block the thing that they really want to block, which is sharing. So we don't just have a suspicion that that was the edge of the wedge. We know it from the enemy's own mouth. But nowadays, in the war on sharing, they're getting so bold that they often don't even bother to bring up excuses. They go straight for demanding filters to block people from sharing. The next threat to our freedom in the digital society comes from data formats that restrict their users. Often it's because they are secret data formats. In this case, we refer to them as digital handcuffs, or DRM, digital restrictions management. For instance, there are applications that save the data the user enters in a secret format. The explanation, we believe, is the developers of those applications found themselves dominating the market. They had little effective competition, and they figured that by switching to a new secret format, they could make competition forever impossible. Nobody would be able to effectively compete with them because nobody else could make a program that could read the user's files. These different secret formats, but it's the same idea, are often used to distribute copies of published works. You find this with video, with music, with books. And you find these digital handcuffs in many well-known proprietary programs, including Microsoft Windows, Mac OS, the software of the iThings, Flash Player, the software of the Amazon Swindle, and of course many more. And once again, it's a consequence of the fact that the users don't have control over these programs. If the users had control over them, the users would make them do what the users want. But they're, in fact, designed to refuse to do what the users obviously are going to want. We also run into problems with formats that are not secret, but patented. For instance, MP3 format is covered in some countries by a patent. And as a result, there are some GNU/Linux distributions that don't include any free software to handle MP3 format. The distributors are afraid of getting in legal trouble if they include the free software which exists to handle that format. This means that the practice of making and distributing MP3 files is disadvantageous to the free software community because people who get those distros don't get free software that can handle MP3. Either they get no software for MP3 or they get a proprietary program, both being bad. Which means that if you make an MP3 file, you are adding to the pressure. That's why I say don't use MP3 format to distribute copies of recordings of my talk. This is my opportunity to push back against that harmful pressure and to teach people to think about what format they're using based on its effects on our community's freedom and not just based on habit and convenience and what they see others doing. It's worth making some extra effort to avoid putting pressure against freedom. And similar issues arise with, for instance, MPEG-4. Then there's the special case of Flash. Flash is not secret except for the digital restrictions management feature, and it's not patented as far as I know, but we don't have free software to handle it because Adobe has changed it so many times. Well, we've been doing our best to catch up. We lag behind by a few versions. And when they say it's a new version, it could be redesigned from zero. They've done that several times. So I believe Flash version 10 is nothing like Flash version 8, which we support. They started over again. That's why it's so much work. It's not just incremental changes. Well, we invite you to help improve GNASH, but in the meantime, don't put any Flash in a website. And if you come across Flash in a website, complain. But this brings me to the next threat to our freedom in the digital society, non-free software. Software that the users don't control. Now, free software means software that respects the user's freedom and community. So it's free as in freedom, not as in price. In Finnish, it's vapaa. You have a clearer word because it doesn't refer to price. So it's very important to, when you're speaking Finnish, to use the Finnish word vapaa and don't vapaa-ohjelmisto, and don't say free software in Finnish. But in English, so that people don't get the wrong idea of the meaning, I explain, think of free speech, not free beer. When a program is not free, we call it non-free software, proprietary software, user subjugating software. Because with software, there are just two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. Free software is when the users control the program. In order to control the program, the users need the four essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish, for whatever purpose, including business, by the way. We're not against business, so you've got to be free to use the program for business. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code of the program and change it so the program does your computing the way you wish. These two freedoms are enough to give each user control over the program. That's separate control. For users that are individuals, users that are organizations, each user has control of the program. But that's not enough, because most users are not programmers and don't know how to exercise freedom 1. They don't understand source code, and they don't want to learn. There are lots of other things to do in life, after all. Not everybody wants to be a programmer. So the separate control over the program is not enough. We need collective control, which means that any group of users are free to work together to exercise control over this program and what it does for them. For collective control, we need two more freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to make and then distribute exact copies of the program. And freedom 3 is the freedom to make and distribute copies of your modified versions if you've made some. These two freedoms permit the members of any group to work together in making improvements and passing them around, and the people in the group or organizations in this group can also offer copies to everyone else or anyone else. This way, the users have control over the program and they make it do what they want it to do. In general, free software does what the users want it to do, which is not the case with proprietary software. You see, if the users don't have the four freedoms, then they don't control the program, which means the program controls the users and the developer controls the program. So this program, this non-free program, is an instrument of the unjust power of the developer over its users. And that's probably why they developed it, so they could get some power over some people. Now, that means the program does what the developer wants. It doesn't do what the users want. It has to, of course, tempt them to use it for something. It's got to be convenient somehow, or else some company has to put them in a position where they can't refuse to use it. But beyond that, it does what the developers want to do to the users, not what the users want, because the users don't really have a say. 30 years ago, when I started the free software movement, non-free software was an injustice because the users didn't have control, and it was often this caused a pain. But at least you could expect the proprietary software developers to be honest, that they were at least trying to make the programs do what users would like. But that's not true nowadays. Things have changed completely. The proprietary software developers have learned that they can get away with making malicious programs, with putting in malicious functionalities that they know the users don't want. such as spy functionalities. I listed programs that spy on the user. Well, those are intentional functionalities. And they're in there not because the users want to be spied on, but because somebody implemented them knowing the users wouldn't like it if they ever found out. And the digital handcuffs, the users, of course, hate DRM, but the implementers, the companies, the developers, chose to inflict it on them. There's another kind of malicious functionality, the backdoor. A backdoor means the program receives commands from somebody, like the developer, telling it to do something to the user that the user might not want, without asking permission and generally without telling the user either. We know of backdoors in Microsoft Windows, in the software of the iThings, in the software in the Amazon swindle, and in nearly all portable phones. Some of these backdoors are universal, which means they can be used to remotely install software changes, any software changes, which means they can, whoever controls the backdoor can do absolutely anything to the users. There's a universal backdoor in Microsoft Windows. There's a universal backdoor in nearly all portable phones. I don't know whether the backdoor in the swindle is universal. I do know it has been used to remotely erase books. Amazon can remotely erase any book. We found this out in 2009 when it remotely erased thousands of copies of a particular book, an Orwellian act. And what was the book? It was 1984 by George Orwell. So, although I call it the swindle, its official name is the Kindle, which I think is meant to hint that its real purpose is remote virtual book burning. Anyway, why do you find malicious functionalities in so many widely used proprietary programs? It's because the developers know the power that they exercise over the users, and that power tempts them to take advantage of it. So anytime they see they could make some money by doing some nasty thing to the users, they do it. If they can snoop on the users, well, maybe they can sell that information. If they can restrict the users, well, maybe then they can get a nice deal from Hollywood. And the back door, well, I'm not sure exactly why they put in the back doors. Maybe it's just a sort of all-purpose, this way we know we've got them completely under our thumb. In any case, I've given you some examples, but there are thousands of other non-free programs out there, and we don't know whether they are malicious or not. How are we going to find out? We can't look at their source code. It's secret. What this shows is a non-free program can never deserve to be trusted. The only way you can trust a non-free program is with blind faith. But with free software, you don't have to give us blind faith. You can trust and verify, because users can read the source code of the free software. Of course, not every user knows how, but some do. Some users of the program are programmers. And from time to time, they'll find a bug and they'll want to fix it, which requires reading source code. And in the process of reading source code, if there were anything nasty, they could find it. And then they could fix it and they could announce it to the world, and it would be a scandal. So what this means is, with free software, the users have an immune system to protect them from malicious functionalities. It's not a perfect guaranteed defense. It's a lot better than being defenseless, which is what the users of proprietary software are, totally defenseless against whatever the developer wants to do to them. So, society has a choice to make. On one side, we have individual freedom, social solidarity, and democracy. We have social solidarity because with freedom too, people are, including non-programmer users, are welcome to share copies with others. We have democracy because when the users control the program develops under the control of the users. So a free program develops under the democratic control of users who participate as much as they wish in the decision about which way that program should go. On the other hand, we have proprietary software that's an instrument for the developer to have power over the users and then command them, exploit them, and abuse them. Society must reject non-free software and choose free software. We invite you to escape from non-free software and come live with us in the free world that we have built. I started the free software movement 30 years ago. It was in January 1984 that I began developing the GNU operating system. I realized that people could not use a computer in freedom with the operating systems that existed. They were all proprietary. The only way to make it possible, well, the only way I could make it possible to use computers in freedom, since I was just one man without much fame or money, was by developing another operating system, and then as the author, I could legally make it free. I was an operating system developer. This was a big job, but at least it was conceivably doable. And if I succeeded, I could say to everyone, here's a free operating system. Now you can run a computer in freedom. Now you can run a computer without letting your freedom be taken away by a proprietary operating system. I decided to make a Unix-like operating system, so I gave it the name GNU, which stands for GNU's Not Unix. That was actually the traditional way in my community to name a program that was inspired by some existing program. You call it by a recursive acronym that says your program is not the other one. So there were Tico text editors, and then there was Tint for Tint is not Tico. And then I developed the first Emacs text editor, and imitations of Emacs included Fine for Fine is not Emacs, and Sign for Sign is not Emacs, and Aina for Aina is not Emacs, and Mince for Mince is not complete Emacs. And version 2 of Aina was called Zwei for Zwei was Aina initially. So, of course, I looked for something is not Unix, and what I came up with was GNU, for GNU's not Unix. But the reason why it's a wordplay is that GNU is a word. It's the name of this animal that lives in Africa, and this is an adorable GNU that needs a home. So then I asked other people to join me in developing GNU, and we worked on it for many years. In 1990, I saw that we had all the essential components except for a kernel. So the Free Software Foundation hired somebody to start writing a kernel. I chose an advanced, elegant design, and perhaps it was too advanced and elegant because it took us 6 years to get a test version running. Fortunately, we didn't have to wait for that, because in 1992, Mr. Torvalds, who had written a proprietary kernel called Linux, liberated it. He released it under a free software license. So once Linux, the kernel, was free, since we already had a free system that was almost complete and missing just the kernel, Linux could fill the last gap in GNU, making a combination which was basically GNU but also contained Linux, the GNU plus Linux operating system. I mean, it wouldn't be wrong to call it the GNU system, but I'd rather give Mr. Torvalds a share of the credit. Could someone be so kind as to make more tea and fill up the cup this time? Thanks. I mean, it's so small anyway. Oh, I didn't realize that there was surveillance of tea drinking in Finland. I thought that was only in China. So now we have, yes. Much better. That's big enough. A little bit more. That's good. That's good. And I'll fill it up with cold water when it's done. So, schools must ethically, it's an ethical imperative, must teach exclusively free software. And when I say schools, that includes all educational activities, including such as adult education. And I mean all levels of schools from nursery school to university. Oh no, let it keep steeping a little bit more, another minute or so. And this is not just to save money. Sometimes you can save money this way. If so, that's a nice secondary benefit. But this is not an issue of how to do education a little better. This is about how to do good education instead of bad education. You see, teaching a non-free program is bad education. It's implanting dependence on a particular entity, which is a social problem. Schools should not be building up social problems. They should be getting rid of social problems. The school has a social mission, which is to educate good citizens of a strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free society. In computing, this means teaching people to use free software, graduating skilled users of free software, ready to participate in a free digital society. The school must never teach a non-free program. Of course, the non-free developers want schools to teach their non-free programs. Many will even offer gratis copies of their non-free programs to schools. Just like drug traffickers that say the first dose is gratis, give it a try, make yourself dependent, then we'll charge you. It works the same thing with the non-free software in the school. Maybe it's gratis for the student in school, then when the student graduates, it's not gratis anymore. And if the student goes to work for a company, that same program is not gratis for the company. Once they get people dependent with the help of the school, then they squeeze the users for all they can. The school should not be helping such a scheme. But there's a deeper reason for the education of the best programmers. You see, some people are natural-born programmers. They have a talent for programming. And typically at 10 to 13 years old, they become fascinated with programming. And if they use a program, they want to know how it works. But when the student asks the teacher, how does it do this? If it's proprietary, the teacher could only say, I'm sorry, we can't find out. It's a secret. So education is not allowed. Every program embodies knowledge. If it's Proprietary, that knowledge is denied to the students. A non-free program is the enemy of the spirit of education and must never be tolerated in a school. But if the program is free, the teacher can explain however much he knows and then offer each of these kids a copy of the source code, saying, read it and you'll understand everything. And those kids will read it because they yearn to understand. And the teacher can say, if you come across some point you can't figure out by yourself, show it to me and we'll figure it out together. And that gives our natural-born programmer the chance to learn a vital lesson for becoming a good programmer. Namely, that part of the code is badly written. It's not clear. That's how you should not write it. Now, in order to develop from natural-born programmers to good programmers, they need to learn what's clear and what's not clear. And you learn this the hard way. You learn it by trying to read something and having trouble figuring it out, and that's how you know it's not clear. You learn to write good, clear code by reading lots of code and writing lots of code. Only free software gives you the chance to read lots of code of real programs, of large programs we really use. Then you have to write lots of code. To learn to write the code for large programs, you have to write lots of code for large programs. But you have to start small. How do you start small in writing code for large programs? You write small changes for existing large programs. Only free software gives you the chance to write changes in existing large programs we really use. Any school can offer natural-born programmers the opportunity to master the skill of programming, but only if it's a free software school. However, there's an even deeper reason. For moral education and citizenship, schools must teach the spirit of goodwill, the habit of helping others. Therefore, each class must have the following rule. Students, if you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share it with the rest of the class, including source code in case someone here wants to learn, because this class is a place where we share our knowledge. Therefore, it's not permitted to bring proprietary software to class except for reverse engineering practice. The school, to set a good example, must follow its own rule. It must bring only free software to class, except for reverse engineering practice, and share copies, including the source code, with everyone in the class. If you have a relationship with a university, or any school, if you have a relationship with a school of any level, if you're a student, or a teacher, or an employee, or an administrator, or a parent, it's your duty, your responsibility to campaign for that school to move to free software and get rid of non-free software. And to do this, you can start by asking the people in charge privately in a nice way. And if that works, great. And if that doesn't work, then it's time to start raising the issue publicly in the communities related to the school, because that's how you make other people aware of the issue and recruit more support. Because you'll have to build the movement until it's strong enough, but the school has to move. And whatever reasons, there'll always be superficial reasons and foolish ones the school might offer for sticking with proprietary software, you must not accept them as being valid. The most that they can prove is that it will take some work to make the school start serving its social mission. All right, some things take work, but they have to be done. Now, it's not feasible to migrate in a week. I understand that. But it's feasible to migrate in some years. The important thing is insist on progress fast enough to complete the migration in some years rather than in some centuries. Because those who don't really want to migrate, if they think they have to say that they will start proposing tiny pilot programs which would succeed in migrating in a few centuries. If you see the steps they propose are that small, then you say, this will take forever to get there. I want to see this finished when I'm still alive, please. I plan to have children next year. Let's get this migration done before it's time for my children to go to this school. Although actually, one way you can contribute to humanity is by not having children. Human population is still increasing, and by not having children, you can reduce your needs from, in addition to reducing the ecological footprint of your life tremendously, you can also free yourself to do the things you think are important instead of being a puppet of money. And there are plenty of other people's children who could use some more attention if you'd like to give some attention to some children. Now, you may have heard the term, quote, open source, unquote. And you may have noticed I haven't used that term. I never do. And the reason is, it's the slogan of people who disagree with the ideas of the free software movement. That's why the term was coined in 1998 by people in the free software community, but who rejected the free software ideals. They wanted a way they could talk about basically the same set of programs without presenting the issue in ethical terms, without saying that it's a matter of freedom. The word open sounds nice, but it doesn't have a strong, sharp, firm core the way freedom does. Freedom is something you fight for. Would you fight for openness? Openness is just sort of vague and nice. And the way they talk about it, they just don't say it's an injustice if a program isn't open. If you look at people who support open source and see what they say, you'll see it's totally different from what we say. Now, they may develop programs that are free. Okay, well, those free programs are just as ethical as any other free programs, judged as programs. But we also have to talk about freedom. You see, in the long term, our future depends on what we value. To establish freedom in a lasting way, it's not enough just to give people freedom. We have to teach people to value freedom, or they will have chances to throw it away. They'll lose it because they don't pay attention. If we want people to hold on to freedom, we've got to show them why. And that means we have to be talking about freedom, talking also about the issues that freedom raises, which, as you see, is what I do. I focus on this because I know that so many other people in our community avoid it. The people who talk about open source, they don't mention any of these things. And that means we who are supporters of free software, we have to do their share of the job as well as our own. Ever since 1998, when most of the people in the free software community started talking about open source, I realized I had better focus on spreading these ideas of freedom because they won't. Basically, free and open are different ideas. If you talk about open, you may convince some people to use some free programs or develop some free programs, but you're not spreading ideas of freedom. And I've chosen to work only in activities that talk about free software and freedom because I want everything I do to help spread those ideas. And if you care about freedom, I suggest you do the same thing as me. There are so many things in the free software world that need our help that if we only work on the ones that hold up the banner of freedom, there'll still be plenty for us to do. And everything we do will be helping in two ways at once. There'll be the actual specific project that we're helping, and we'll be spreading the awareness of the issues of freedom at the same time. Even in a private discussion, just by saying free or vapa instead of open, you will be helping to spread these ideas. Oh, and when you talk about the operating system that I started in 1984 and which Torvalds contributed the last piece to in 1992, please call it gnu+linux. Lots of people call it just Linux, which means giving me and the whole GNU project none of the credit at all, which is not really nice. But this gets an extra importance from the fact that Torvalds is not a supporter of the free software movement. He's an open source person. He doesn't see this, he doesn't believe that you deserve to control your computing. He doesn't believe he deserves to control his computing. He says he's happy to use and develop non-free software. He doesn't develop non-free software anymore, as far as I know, but he said he was happy doing so. Well, he's got a right to his views, but if you give the credit for our work to him, you're also boosting the ideology he stands for. Millions of people have heard of the GNU system, but they've heard of it under the name Linux. And they think it was all started by Mr. Torvalds in 1991. And it wasn't. And then they think it was inspired by his view of these issues, which it wasn't. And that's where it does real harm. Because if they copy Torvalds' way of thinking and don't even consider the free software movement's idea, then they don't learn to value their own freedom. And that means they won't be at our side fighting for freedom. And we could lose, we could all lose because of that. The next threat to our freedom in the digital society, actually the next three threats to our freedom, come from internet services, websites more or less. One is that many websites try to run non-free software on the user's computer silently. The user's not informed of this. These programs are typically written in JavaScript, and they're included in web pages. If you visit a web page and that page contains a JavaScript program, the program gets silently installed into your browser, and it runs in your computer, whether it's free or not. A program in JavaScript can be free or non-free, just like any other program. If it carries a free software license, then it's free software. Otherwise, it's non-free. As it happens, most JavaScript code is non-free. But in any case, you visit the page and whatever JavaScript code is in it gets installed into your browser and run, and you don't even know. The browser doesn't warn you. So if you don't want to run non-free software, how do you stop it? Well, one way is disable JavaScript. That's what I do. But there is a newer way, which is more selective. We developed an extension to Firefox called Libre.js. This program analyzes the JavaScript code that tries to get into the browser to see if it's either trivial or free. In those cases, the code is permitted. But if it's non-trivial and non-free, then it's blocked. And Libre.js warns you. It says, non-free JavaScript encountered. It does one other thing. It searches heuristically through the site, looking for how to contact the webmasters. If you've ever tried to complain to webmasters, I'm sure you know that it's a pain in the neck to see how to do that, how to reach them. Well, Libre.js does it for you. It just looks at the pages, looking for certain keywords that probably indicate that this is a way to contact the webmasters. And it shows you what it found, which means you can complain very quickly. And that means you better complain. We need you to complain. Every time there's non-free JavaScript in a site, complain. Because how are we going to convince those sites to free their JavaScript code? Only with lots of complaints. And they've got to come from you. The complaint doesn't have to be very long. You know, you can say, I couldn't use your site because it required running non-free JavaScript code. Please put free licenses on it. See gnu.org/philosophy/javascript-trap.html. And that takes you only a minute. So you could complain 10 times every day and it would only take you 10 minutes. Can't you spare 10 minutes for the cause? 10 minutes a day? But this is the sort of thing we need to start piling up the complaints. The next threat to your freedom from websites or, in general, services you reach over the internet is abuse of your personal data. A lot of websites do surveillance. I already talked about surveillance in general. I should just mention something about Facebook surveillance. If you visit a page and you see a like button, Facebook knows that your computer visited that page. Here's how. The image of the like button comes from a Facebook server. The server sends it to your machine, so it knows the IP address of your machine. And your browser told it the URL of the page you're looking at, so it knows that your machine visited that page. Even if you never had a Facebook account, Facebook finds this out. However, our browser, IceCat, blocks it because it blocks all third-party things in a web page. So Facebook won't find out what pages you visited if you're using if you're using IceCat. So in any case, aside from surveillance, websites ask for lots of personal data. Sometimes they need the personal data to do the job. Sometimes they gratuitously do the job in a way that makes them need lots of personal data. For instance, instead of giving you some information so that you can figure out something for yourself, they ask you all about you, and then they figure it out and they tell you. But that means they get all sorts of personal data about you. I read something many years ago. Someone had set up a website where you could give your body measurements, and then the site would show what certain kinds of clothing would look like on you. Now, this could have been implemented by having clothing companies send you these programs to compute what or sending you images which could be scaled according to your measurements, and that could be all done all inside your computer, and nobody would find anything about you. But no, they prefer to get your personal body measurements, along with your name probably and your address and everything else, because they want to profile you. So these sites are asking commonly for a lot more data than they really need, but they refuse to do the service unless you give them everything that they demand. And afterwards, what's going to happen? They could show that personal data to someone you don't want it to be shown to. And they probably will. And if it's a U.S. company, it has no choice about handing the data over to the U.S. government, because U.S. companies are required to hand over all personal data that they have, with a few limited exceptions, to the government on request without even a court order. So you can be pretty sure that if you give personal information to a website, it's going to mistreat you. There are some, like Twitter, for instance, which have fought really hard to try not to mistreat people, but even they can't win against some of these requirements. The other threat to your freedom from websites is something that's less obvious, and most people aren't even aware that it's an issue. It's what happens. I'm feeling a need to sit down. Strange. It's what happens when the website offers to do your computing. Now, what do I mean by your computing? I mean a computing activity that has nothing to do with anybody but you, and that you could have done, therefore, inside your own computer if only you had the right program to do it. If even in principle you could have done it inside your own computer, then it's your computing. And that means you deserve to have full control over it. But you can't have control over it if it's being done by somebody else's server. Then he controls it, and you don't. He controls how that computing is done. He decides what programs to put in his server. You don't control what programs are in the server. You don't control how they work. So if you entrust your own computing activity to somebody else's server, you have lost control over what should be yours to control. It's the same bad consequence. Oh, and we call it service as a software substitute, or SaaS. It's the same harmful consequence that you get if you run a non-free program. It does computing that you don't control, because you don't control the non-free program. The users don't. The owner or developer controls it. So there are two ways you as a user can lose control of your computing. One way is running a non-free program. Then it's done inside your computer, but you don't control what the non-free program does, so you've lost control over that computing. The other way is with SaaS, where you send all the data to somebody else's server and it does the computing and sends you the result, or maybe takes action on your behalf based on the result. And you don't control how that computing is done because it's done by copies of programs that are in the server. And it's not your server. You can't see or touch those programs. You can only send data to the server and see what it does. So these are two different pathways to the same bad result. And the only way to avoid the bad result is reject those two pathways. The only way not to lose your freedom to a non-free program is don't run non-free software. The only way to avoid losing your freedom to SaaS is don't use SaaS. In fact, in many ways, SaaS is equivalent to a non-free program in terms of its consequences. But actually, it's even worse. Remember how I explained that many non-free programs contain spy functionalities that send data to a server about what the user is doing? Well, with SaaS, the user has to send all the pertinent data to the server in order for the server to do that user's computing. So it's the same result. The server has the user's data. And remember how I explained that some non-free programs, like Windows and the software in portable phones, contains a universal backdoor that can be used to remotely impose software changes and thus change how the user's computing gets done without asking the user's permission to change it? Well, with SaaS, the server owner, of course, can install different software in the server. And he should be allowed to do so. It's his computer. But when he does that, that changes how the user's computing gets done in the server. So it changes how the user's computing gets done without asking the user for permission to change it. Thus, SAS, service as a software substitute, is inherently equivalent to running a non-free program which is spyware and has a universal backdoor. In other words, it's the equivalent of non-free malware. Malware is a word that means a program designed to mistreat the user. So what I showed you earlier is that many well-known proprietary programs are malware. But SAS is equivalent to running non-free malware. So, of course, you shouldn't run SAS. But I should point out that most of the services provided by websites are not SAS because what they do is not the user's own computing. What they do, or at least most of what they do, is some kind of communication, which is not one person's own computing. For instance, if you want to talk with me, that's not your own personal activity. That's a joint activity for you and me. There's no reason why you should have total control over a joint activity. The places where you deserve full control is when it's not a joint activity, when it's purely your activity. Those are the cases, those are the kinds of computing activities which you deserve control over and which SAS would take away from you. But when it's a joint activity, you can't expect to have full control over it. There's no reason why you should rather than the other people involved. So in those cases, the issue of SAS just is not applicable. The question doesn't arise. So SAS is not an issue with most web services, but it does arise, and it's an important issue when it does arise. So you've got to be aware of it. And nowadays, computers are being sold which are designed to lead people to to entrust all their data to some company's servers and do their computing with SAS. And those computers are just designed to lead people into being fools. So don't get computers like that. Make sure that whatever computer you get allows you to do your computing inside the computer and keep your data inside the computer or on your own other storage devices, your own other computers, and thus not give any company such control over you. The next threat to our freedom in the digital society comes from the use of computers in elections, which is very dangerous. It's dangerous because you can't tell what the computer is doing, and there's no entity involved in the election that you can put blind faith in. You can't put blind faith in the company that made the voting computer. That company might fiddle with the program to rig the election. You can't put blind faith in the electoral authority. That agency might fiddle with the program to rig the election. Traditionally, voting systems have been designed with the idea that everybody involved in the election is being monitored by others at all times except for the voter when making the choice. But everybody working in the voting place is supposed to be watched by other people working in the voting place. In the U.S., political parties send poll watchers who are just supposed to be there and watch. They're watching in case someone tries to commit fraud for some other party. Paper-based voting systems are not terribly complicated. Anybody of ordinary intelligence can learn to understand what fraud would look like, and then can work as a poll watcher, effectively monitoring to make sure nobody else commits fraud. But how can you tell what fraud would look like inside of a computer? You can't. The only way to check for that is for experts to study the program. Ordinary people can't tell whether the program is fraudulent or not. But even the experts can't reliably tell. Suppose a team of experts study the code before the election and they say, we have concluded this program is correct. So what? How do you know somebody didn't install a modified program the morning before the election, which is designed to calculate the wrong totals, and then puts back the correct version the evening after the election, and the only trace of the fraudulent, of the dishonest program was some totals? If you can't do a recount based on paper ballots, you can't trust the outcome of the election. So, we must insist on voting with paper. Elections are special because of the fact that you can't trust any of the agencies or people involved, and you also can't verify that they acted correctly. You see, if you pay a store with your credit card, you're trusting the store, but you'll see if the store charges you too much. So that's a basis for trust. If dishonesty will be detected, the store's probably not going to try it. So you've got a basis for trust. But you can't have that in an election. There's no way you can verify that they counted your vote right or that they didn't pack the election with fake ballots. So the computerized system is just not trustworthy. Even worse is internet voting. That's really laughably crazy. Washington, D.C. was considering internet voting, so it did a test run, not a real election, but a test run to challenge people to see if they could break the security. And indeed, a fictional robot won the election because the security was totally broken. But even if the security of the voting system was solid, you still can't trust it. What if you're voting from a computer that's a zombie, part of a botnet? Then the botnet will decide how you vote. On the screen, it'll say you're voting for A, and it'll send a vote for C. And there's no way you can tell that. And the election agency might count it correctly as a vote for C, but that's not the way you wanted to vote. And then there's another danger. What if your boss says, I want you to vote on the computer in my office with me watching? We can't allow that. So internet voting is too dangerous. Should not even be considered. But then another threat to our freedom in the digital society comes from the war on sharing. This means the decades-long campaign by the copyright industry to stop people from getting the benefit of digital technology, which is that it facilitates copying, manipulating, and transferring information. Well, they don't want us to be able to do those things, and they've been fighting for decades to make it impossible. They started with propaganda. They said, if you share, you're a pirate. What are they really saying when they say that? They're saying that helping other people is the moral equivalent of attacking ships. Morally speaking, that's as false as can be, because attacking ships is very bad, but sharing is good. So let's not call them both by a single word. Therefore, when people ask me what I think of piracy, I say attacking ships is very bad. When they ask me what I think of movie piracy, I say, I like the first Pirates of the Caribbean. You get the point. I look for a humorous, blatant way to refuse to use their propaganda meaning of the word. Please join me. There's only one exception, and that is if you're talking about the Pirate Party. Now, the Pirate Party is following an old tradition of taking the enemy's insult and throwing it back at him. Well, sometimes that works, and by all means, it's worth trying if you want to. So that's the one case where I don't refuse to say pirate meaning anything other than attacking ships. But when talking about sharing, I will not call that piracy. And you shouldn't either. And they've used other propaganda terms like theft and counterfeiting. If it's bad, they will say that sharing is it. But if they had stopped with propaganda, it wouldn't be a war. They have a right to express their views, disgusting though they are. But they didn't stop with propaganda. They went on to truly attack people. They perverted our technology, loading it with digital handcuffs. Not only the software, but the hardware. PCs today are made with malicious hardware whose sole purpose is to restrict users. The copyright industry, working together with tech companies such as Intel and AMD and IBM and Apple and Microsoft, they've converted the technology offered to us from our servants to our jailers. And we've seen digital handcuffs imposed on video with DVDs. And then, after people found ways to break the handcuffs of DVD players, then they developed Blu-rays, which have even tighter handcuffs. And nobody has yet managed to fully break those handcuffs. But then, the worst thing is with streaming, because they could switch to a new DRM system in 5 minutes. Even if we broke the DRM of Netflix or Spotify, it wouldn't do much good. We just have to refuse to use streaming services. If you can't have a copy of your own, it's not ethical. It's an attack on people's freedom, and you must fight back. In music, although music is available over the internet without DRM nowadays, it has other injustices, such as end-user licenses, which are contracts that restrict the user more tightly than copyright law does. If you get a download from an internet music store, you don't get the same rights you would have if you buy a CD. Therefore, I will never use those stores. I will buy a CD, but I won't use those stores. And the other thing they do is they make people identify themselves, which is an injustice in its own right. So if I buy books or music, the store doesn't know who I am, because I pay cash and I won't say who I am. But they didn't stop there. Although I should say a little bit more about the Amazon swindle, because this is the point where it fits, and the Amazon swindle is really nasty. Because I call it the swindle because by its mode of functioning, it swindles readers out of the traditional freedoms of readers of books. For instance, the freedom to acquire a book anonymously paying cash. Impossible with Amazon. Amazon won't let people pay cash. Amazon makes users identify themselves, so it has a giant database recording all the books each user has read. such surveillance threatens human rights. We can't tolerate its existence. We must put an end to it. Then there's the freedom to give the book to someone else after you read it, or to lend it to various people before or after you read it, or to sell it to a used bookstore. Amazon abolishes all those freedoms with digital handcuffs in the software of the swindle and with its end-user license agreements that say that the user doesn't own any books. Amazon doesn't respect private property. Amazon says all your books belong to us. Literally, Amazon says users don't own the books. They've only leased the books under the conditions that Amazon chooses to impose. And this means that the users of the swindle are antisocial. The swindle itself makes users antisocial. If your friendship among people who read includes lending books, when your friend starts reading in a way, that means he can't lend you books anymore. He won't lend you books anymore. He has broken off his friendship. Warn your friends in advance that this is what it would mean if they started using the swindle or any other comparable product that restricts lending or giving books. It would mean that they don't want to be your friend anymore. But don't tell them this after they've broken off the friendship. Warn them in advance so that they know not to make the mistake. So that they know that if someone offers them a swindle as a gift, that they should say, no, it's an antisocial product. It would make me stop lending books to people, and that's wrong. I don't want to be like that. I don't want this thing. Thanks, but no thanks. We must proactively discourage our friends from being swindled out of friendship with us. And then there's the freedom to keep a book as long as you wish, which is eliminated by the back door I told you about that allows the Orwellian remote erasure of books. By the way, after 2009's incident with deleting 1984, Amazon promised it would never do this again unless ordered to by the state. Which, if you've read 1984, is not very comforting. But don't worry, Amazon didn't keep its promise anyway. So, digital handcuffs are nasty, but they didn't stop there. Then they started purchasing laws in various countries, starting with the US, banning the things that people make to help others break digital handcuffs. And then they started suing teenagers for hundreds of thousands of dollars for participating in peer-to-peer sharing. And then they began, then they needed to escalate even more. So they started purchasing laws in various countries that abolish a basic principle of justice: no punishment without a fair trial. But they have arranged to punish people with disconnection from the internet or with fines for being accused several times of sharing. Proof and a trial, they're not needed. This is how it is in the UK, for instance. In the US, a law like this would be unconstitutional. So instead of a law, Obama arranged a private deal between the 5 major US ISPs and the copyright industry, whereby the ISPs will privately punish their own customers if they're accused of sharing. And the ISPs could do this because they're not regulated. They're not common carriers. They're not required to just pass along traffic without paying attention to what it is, which they should have been. But apparently even these laws are not enough. So Japan has now imposed a 2-year prison sentence on anyone who downloads a copy without authorization from the net. In the UK, a 10-year prison sentence has been proposed. And if these laws are not enough, I guess they'll start executing people who are accused of sharing, because they want to go as to whatever lengths it takes to get people to stop sharing and stop getting the benefits of digital technology. But it's no coincidence that they keep proposing cruel, draconian measures. Thanks to digital technology, sharing is good, and thanks to digital technology, sharing is easy. So people share. And the only way to stop people from sharing is with cruel, draconian measures. So, of course, the measures are wrong because the goal is wrong. Sharing is good. Sharing must be legal. We must put an end to the war on sharing, not just to the specific unjust methods that are used, but to the unjust goal itself. We must legalize sharing conclusively and reject the demands of the copyright industry. What else must we do to copyright law? We must legalize remix, which means taking pieces out of various works and putting them together and making something that's totally different in its spirit. Because that's making a new creative work. And the whole point of copyright is to encourage that, to interpret copyright law in a way that interferes with making new works is completely stupid. It's the sort of thing that happens when the interpretation of the law has been perverted by interests that are not supposed to be the ones that are being served, such as the interests of the copyright industry rather than the arts. In addition, we must prohibit DRM. It should be illegal to distribute systems with DRM. We must prohibit the narrow, restrictive contracts that digital book and music stores and many others use, so that the rights that copyright law leaves to the users are inalienable, that they can't be denied. And we must shorten the term of copyright. Copyright can often last more than a century, which is ridiculous. I think copyright should last for 10 years. 10 years starting from the date of publication, that is. But when the copyright industry companies demand increased power over us, they say it's in the name of the artists. And this is, well, it's not quite a half-truth. It's like a 10% truth and 90% lie. Because mostly the copyright system benefits those companies. Those companies abuse the artists every way they can, with the exception of the stars. They treat the stars very nicely. But the stars are just a tiny fraction of all the artists. When the record companies say that if you share music, you're stealing from the artists, they're wrong, because the record companies already took almost everything, leaving very little we could possibly take if we tried. When I buy commercial CDs, which is a way I commonly get music, I am always sad to know that I'm not supporting the artists. I know that if it's from a major record company, it's going to keep the money. The artist won't get it. I also know if it's from an independent record company that they generally don't make enough money to pay the artist anything. So, I mean, I wish I were supporting the artists, but I know I'm not. So, what they're saying is mostly bogus, but there is one element of truth in it. If we want to have art, we've got to support the artists. So I propose that we do so, and not just with the existing methods, buying copies, paying for performances. I propose new systems by which we can support artists better, systems which are compatible with legalizing sharing. With these systems, the artists will all say, please share my work. A lot of them do it now, but they all will once these systems are working. So I have two suggestions. One system works through tax money. The government will collect a certain amount of money, perhaps out of the general budget, perhaps with tax on internet connectivity, and this money will be divided among the artists based on their popularity. Why based on their popularity? I'm just being conservative. The copyright system aims to work to pay artists based on their popularity. So let's keep that. How do you measure popularity? Well, you could do sampling. You have a poll. You could invite certain people voluntarily to let their listening and watching and reading habits be tracked and then anonymously sent in, and it'll be added up. You can measure how often works are copied on peer-to-peer networks. Anyway, you could make a popularity figure for each artist. Then what? How do you decide how much money each artist gets? The obvious way is in linear proportion to popularity, but that gives bad results. And the reason is the stars are very, very popular. A star, A, could easily be 1,000 times as popular as respected and fairly popular artist B. And with linear proportion, that means A would get 1,000 times as much money as B, which means in order to give B enough, we've got to make A super rich, which is wasting our money. So I propose we take the cube root of the popularity of each artist. The cube root looks like this. It keeps on rising, but it rises more and more slowly. The cube root of 1,000 is 10. So if A is 1,000 times as popular as B, A will get 10 times as much money as B. Not 1,000 times, just 10 times. So the effect of the cube root is to transfer most of the money from a few stars to the many mid-range popularity artists, which means that this system will effectively support the artists who really need more help. This system will enable more artists to quit their day jobs and dedicate themselves fully to art and get to be as good as they can be. So if we want to support the arts efficiently, here's how to do it. Now, because the cube root keeps on rising, with this system it remains the case that the more popular you are, the more money you get. But it doesn't rise linearly, so you don't get tremendously more. And that's why it's an efficient use of our money to promote the arts. The other system I have in mind is each player gets a button to send a certain sum of money to the artists. And you can push it if you like, but you don't have to. Nobody punishes you if you don't push it. It's entirely up to you. But when you send the money, you'll feel good. And the idea is it should be a small sum of money, but not a tiny sum. I'm not talking about micropayments. These might be mini payments. In Finland, maybe €0.50 might be a good amount. The idea is if it's too small, even if everybody pushes this button, it'll still be a small amount of money and won't do much good. If it's too big, people won't push it. So there's going to be some optimal amount which maximizes the total that people send to artists in any period of time. I'm just guessing it might be €0.50 here. Each country, I suppose, would fix this, trying to optimize the results. And then you would push or not. But why wouldn't you? I think that each one of you could afford to push this button every day, and you wouldn't miss the amount of money that you would send in a year. Of course, there are some people who can't afford that much, poor people, and they will never give. And that's okay. We don't need to squeeze money out of poor people to support the artists. There are enough non-poor who would like to support artists. Now, in fact, voluntary payments are working pretty well already. There are musicians who are supported by donations through their websites. Of course, they're not €0.50. They ask for much bigger amounts, maybe starting with 50. Maybe if you give €50, they'll give you a special deluxe CD. And for €500, maybe they'll have dinner with you. I don't know. The point is, you understand how these things work. They don't get so many donations, but it adds up. In addition, a lot are having success with download this and pay if you like. The humble ebook bundle contained science fiction books by a number of well-known science fiction writers. They said, pay if you like. They got $1 million in a month. And crowdfunding is also another form of voluntary payment. It's starting to work pretty well. So, voluntary payment does work. But the more people are participating, the better it'll work. So, why do I have to stop in 10 minutes? Well, I don't know who told them that. Well, look, you're not prisoners. You can leave at any time. You're free. So, this is what we've got to do. There's one more threat to our freedom in the digital society. Remember I told you about how the US ISPs agreed to punish their own customers? This is because their customers don't have any rights. In the internet, whatever we do, we don't do it by right. We do it on sufferance, as long as certain companies are willing to enable us to do it. Imagine if you lived in a building and between your front door and the street was land owned by a company that wouldn't let you cross unless you pay or please the company and meet whatever its demands are. That's the way the internet is. If you have a point of view you want to communicate, you can write it on a piece of paper, you can carry it to the street and show it to people. You have a right to do that. You don't need permission from a company to do that. If you want to receive donations for the cause, you can carry a can and people can put cash into it. You don't need support from a company to do that. It's your right. But if you want to present your views on the internet, you need the cooperation of an ISP, a hosting company, and a domain registrar. And they can cut you off. And if you want to accept payment, well, now we have Bitcoin. But a few years ago, you had to have the use of the help cooperation of a payment company that could cut you off. And we saw how dangerous this was when the US tried to chase WikiLeaks off the internet. Not by prosecution, because there were no grounds to prosecute. WikiLeaks apparently had not committed any crime. But the US wanted WikiLeaks off the network anyway, so it began a campaign of intimidating the companies that provided internet-related services and other digital services to WikiLeaks. For instance, WikiLeaks had rented an Amazon virtual server. But Amazon was intimidated into deciding that WikiLeaks had violated the terms of service and closing its account. And Amazon had the power to do this unilaterally. It was prosecutor, jury, and executioner. Then the US got a lot of WikiLeaks' domain names taken away. Then it decided to cut off the way people were sending money to WikiLeaks. So companies such as PayPal and Google and Visa and MasterCard and Bank of America and many more all said that they would refuse to send any payments to WikiLeaks. Then a company in Iceland decided to accept payment on behalf of WikiLeaks, so the credit card companies cut off that company too. And then something good happened. It turns out that European Union law says that Visa and MasterCard can't cut off a customer arbitrarily because they have too big a share of the market. So that company sued and won, and they were required to resume service to that company. This is an example of how it has to be. The usual kinds of services involved in digital society, whatever they will be in the future, they must not be allowed to cut off users without going to court and proving grounds to do so. If you sign a contract to rent a place to live in Boston, the landlord can't just kick you out, no matter what you do. The landlord has to go to court and prove that there are grounds. And if there are grounds, the landlord will win and you'll have to leave. If there aren't grounds, the landlord will lose and you can stay. And in any case, the landlord can't just order you out. That's how it has to be with all the services that are essential for participating in the digital society. That they can't be cut off by the decision of some company. So, for more information about free software, look at gnu.org. And in particular, for a concise statements of the arguments for free software, look at gnu.org/free software even more important.html. For the difference between open source and free software, look at gnu.org/philosophy/open source misses the point.html. There's also fsf.org, the website of the Free Software Foundation, and fsfe.org, the website of Free Software Foundation Europe. They could both use your support. You can join either organization. If you want to join the Free Software Foundation and pay your dues in cash, you can approach me after the talk. But you can also join through the websites. Meanwhile, here is an adorable GNU that needs a home. So I'm going to auction it for the benefit of the Free Software Foundation. If you buy it, I'll be happy to sign the card for you. If you have a penguin at home, then you need to get a GNU for your penguin, because as we all know, a penguin can't hardly function without a GNU. And when you bid, please wave your arm and shout the amount of money, because I have hearing trouble. You want me to hear your bid. We can accept payment either in cash or with a credit card if it can make international purchases by phone. And I'm going to start with the regular price, which is 20 euros. Do I get 20 euros? How much? I've got 20. Do I get 25? I've got 20. Do I get 20? How much? I've got 25. Do I get 30 or more? How much? No, I have got to go up by 5 at least. I don't want to take so much time. Okay, 30. How much? I've got 50. Do I get 55? I've got 50 euros. Do I get 55 or more for this adorable GNU that needs a home? How much? I've got 60. Do I get 65 or more? I've got 60 euros. Do I get 65 or more? 65 or more for this adorable GNU? 65 or more to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom? 65 or more? Last chance to bid 65 or more for this adorable GNU. Last chance. I've got 70. Do I get 75 or more? 75 or more for this adorable GNU. 75 or more to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. Last chance to bid 75 or more. Last chance. Going. Gone for 70. How do you wish to pay? Okay. Come on. Thank you. I'll sign it after the question. So now it's time for questions. Even with the microphone, you need to speak loud and clearly and slowly so I can hear you, because I'm hard of hearing. Questions?
Any opinions on the Freedom Box?
The Freedom Box is a good thing. It's actually a gnu+linux distro to run in a personal server. And there are these little boxes you can buy and plug them into the wall that'll be your own network server. You want to ask a question?
I hope so.
Okay.
Oh, so you already answered, okay. So you raised so many questions that make me want to go report it to police or the other way to free myself. But I'll try to ask something that's relevant, hopefully, to this crowd. So this center is something that where lots of local startups are trying to be created, and it's actually local creation of this wonderful microphone that has some awesome Finnish algorithm inside that make me sound even more clearly than this microphone. And, if I was a developer of this microphone, I would definitely value collecting some data about the frequencies people use, about the voice tempers, and I don't think this box collects any information, but the competitor 5 years from now may very well collect this information, and they will make a better service.
Well, that would be unjust. Unless they could ask you, if you don't mind.
And the problem with the statistical data is that once you ask people, you immediately get statistical bias.
It doesn't matter, because there are other ethical issues here. Basically, that desire to improve the product is less important than respect for our privacy.
Then shall it be the consumer decision, if the microphone was collecting data, I should refuse using it?
Well, we shouldn't let them collect any data. It's that simple. Unless they give people optionally the chance to give in some data if they don't mind, that's okay. If it says, do you mind donating some data about your usage, and you can do it if you wish, opt in, I don't object to that. But a product that's designed to make people give data is evil, and those deserve to be fought, and I would recommend making them illegal.
Hello, I'm Roberto Corsini from the Helsinki City Public Library, and as you know, public libraries have been defending open access since the dawn of time, basically, with material things, but that is at risk in the digital age.
Yes, DRM risks converting libraries into retail outlets for publishers, and libraries must refuse to go down that path. They must say, that is corruption, and we will not go there. You may lose, but surrender guarantees defeat.
Thank you. Yeah, that was my question.
Yeah, I have an idea based on the talk. So you mentioned the mini payments to the artists, and I think the traditional blockage is the transaction fees from the banks and other
Right, with the
retailers.
existing payment systems, the transaction fees are too high.
What do you think about Bitcoin-based mini?
Well, Bitcoin, I'm sure has some kind of transaction cost in it somehow. In practice, of course, in theory, Bitcoin doesn't charge you anything for doing a transaction, but getting your transaction into the blockchain probably requires some service that will charge you something. The other problem with Bitcoin is it's not anonymous, although there are people trying to set up services on top of Bitcoin that mix payments to make them anonymous. Maybe that will solve the problem. I wish that I could. One thing we need to do to put an end to surveillance is to put an end to advertising that's based on tracking people. But that means we need to give websites another way to get money from their users. How about if we could pay them? I pay for other kinds of services. I wouldn't mind paying a website for a service either, as long as I could pay with digital cash and be anonymous. I buy CDs. I wouldn't mind buying a digital download on the same basis that I will buy a CD, namely I pay cash, they don't know who it is, I don't sign a contract, and there's no DRM. And most of that's perfectly feasible, and there are even a few publishers that, for instance, Tor Books, which has nothing to do with the program Tor, it's a science fiction publisher, sells with no DRM and no end-user license agreements. All we need is an anonymous way to buy. If we had anonymous payment, we could then convince them to do it. So we need an anonymous payment system, which can be done with known digital cash technology. For instance, with David Chaum's digital cash technology, and it has interesting properties. For instance, you know how much digital cash each user gets from the bank. You know how much digital cash each service receives in total. That is, the banks know, and the government could tell. But no one can tell who paid whom. And he originally designed this for toll collection systems. But governments prefer to do surveillance with their toll collection. I think we need to require governments to replace them with anonymous toll collection systems. Other questions?
Yes, here. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Antti Poikola from Open Knowledge Finland. Have you heard about this movement called My Data, which basically states that people should have right to get the data what is collected, personal data in any internet service or so, that they could get it for themselves and use it and redistribute it and direct it to some other services?
Well, I think that if we could make sites obey this, it might be good as a political step to show people how much data is being collected so that they might fight back. But I wouldn't agree to give any data merely because of that. Okay. I don't identify myself to websites. Are there any more questions? There's one here. There are two here.
Okay. You mentioned we can use Bitcoin nowadays to be not dependent on any middleman when it comes to financial payments. But do you see any hope of doing that same thing with ISPs? Like now, if the government doesn't want what you're doing, doesn't like what you're doing, they can maybe force the ISP.
With ISPs, no, you need to organize politically to make it possible. But with internet cafes, in many countries, they will let you pay cash. But there are some countries with tyrannical rules, like China and India, and I think also Peru, that require people to show identification before they can use an internet cafe.
What about these meshnet projects? Do you see
Well,
any hope with them?
I won't say it's impossible, but they have difficult problems to solve before they could actually be useful. I mean, if you wanted to just talk with your neighbors, it's easy to make a meshnet, or people who live in the same town with you. But suppose you wanted to talk with the Free Software Foundation, which is in Boston, Massachusetts. How are you going to do that through your meshnet?
Yeah, I guess
Your meshnet doesn't go across the Atlantic.
Yeah, I guess it has to connect to the internet.
It probably doesn't go across the Baltic either. And it probably doesn't run through Lapland either.
I have a note and then a question. First, a note about elections and votings. The paper voting doesn't itself guarantee the right result.
I can't understand the sounds you are saying. You need to speak louder and pronounce your consonants more carefully.
Thank you. The paper voting itself doesn't guarantee right result.
When you say a right result, do you mean a good candidate being elected, or do you mean an honest election?
Honest election. So Joseph Stalin has said that in the voting, the votes don't decide. The guy who counts the votes, he decides.
Right, exactly. And of course, in free countries, we have election systems where the counting is monitored in such a way as to try to make it honest.
Anyway, the question is about censorship. Isn't it anyway good that Finland has some lightweight censorship? Because the list you mentioned, I think it contained, for example, websites selling drugs. Wouldn't it be acceptable that the drug trade, which is forbidden in this country according to the law, is not supported by the websites?
I don't think that prohibition of drugs is a good thing. But also, censorship is so dangerous that whatever harm you might hope to prevent by censoring some websites, having censorship itself is a threat to human rights.
This might be a little off topic, but it's
I can't understand your words.
Yeah, can you hear it now?
I could hear the beginning, but not the end.
Okay, thanks for the talk. And my question is about Bitcoin. Like, when people start mining Bitcoin like anything these days, it's putting a lot of impact on the environment, especially with the usage of electricity.
I don't know about that. I doubt that Bitcoin mining is using much electricity compared with all the rest of the internet. But I don't actually know.
All right.
This is a detail. I'm not an expert on the details of Bitcoin.
No, my point was that like such technology which have been developed for some other purpose, like for bettering the transaction systems, can have bad impact. So then it comes to the e-books. Because of e-books, we can save paper, and it has other good impacts on the environment.
But they're an injustice, so you should reject commercial e-books of today.
Yeah, so shouldn't we try to find a balance between these two instead of completely rejecting?
I can't hear you now.
Shouldn't we try to find a balance between these two?
No, absolutely not. We must not. And the reason is, once you start being willing to compromise on human rights, then you lose them. But if we stand firm for human rights, we can have the other benefits and the human rights. But of course, those who want to take away our human rights, they offer us something with some other benefits, and then they say, oh, why don't you find a balance? Get some of these other benefits by abandoning human rights. And the result is we end up getting the other benefit at a cost in human rights that we could have avoided. We don't need to have ebooks attack our human rights. The technology permits ebooks that don't attack our human rights. So the point, and they would save just as much in paper, and they wouldn't use any more electricity. So the point is, don't take the handy compromise which is offered to us today and attacks our human rights. Fight until we get the outcome which has the benefit and keeps our human rights.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? I hope not, because I'm feeling a bit tired. It looks like we're done. So keep in mind that we're still selling stuff at the table outside the door, sort of on the left. And there may still be some stickers on the table just before that little kiosk there in the back.